The talk show host Stephen Colbert has a segment that he does periodically called the Colbert Questionnaire. It's kind of I don't know, it's a trope or standard issue thing that has a number of journalists have done. There's a preset set of questions, and the guest gets to answer them, and thereby we learn about the guests. And some of the questions are whimsical in nature. What is your favorite sandwich? What is your least favorite smell? Some of them are silly or impossible. What number am I thinking of right now, or at least involve magic? And some of them touch on the great questions of being alive. What do you think happens when we die? Arnold Schwarzenegger was on the show, I don't know, 2 or 3 months ago. Schwarzenegger is always an enormously entertaining guest, and he got to the question, what do you think happens when we die? And Schwarzenegger gave a very animated answer to this question. I'm sorry I can't do the accent. Feels like it would sell the bit a little more, but you'll just have to imagine it. Schwarzenegger said, well, there's a reason that I'm doing all of this working out, that I'm pumping all of this iron, that I'm doing all of this exercise. If death comes for me, I will battle him, I will defeat him, and I will terminate him. And there was rapturous applause from the audience. And I don't know if Schwarzenegger was at all joking. There was no indication that he was. Regardless, the answer that he gave was absurd in nature. But lest we sit in judgment of him, it was actually a very commonplace absurdity in which he was engaging, one that you encounter all of the time. Phoebe and I updated our wills, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago. If you've done that, you'll know that like buying a major thing, it involves signing paper after paper after paper. And at the end, the lawyer handed the papers to us, said, here is your will, or here's both of your wills. I hope you never need them. So, spoiler alert, we are going to need our wills. We will die someday, and we will need those wills or whatever one succeeds them. Now, I hope this doesn't sound like self-congratulation. I hope this doesn't sound like me standing up here saying, thank God I'm not like other people, because I engage in exactly the same kind of thinking, the same absurd thinking myself. I've reached the age where I have peers who are having heart attacks. And when I receive the news that a peer has had a heart attack, do you know what thought goes through my head? I immediately start wondering what conditions they had that I don't. And as a consequence, how this doesn't apply to me. I said, well, they smoked, or they never exercised, or they have a lot of stress in their life. The heart attack is a comment on their aging and mortality and not on mine. This business of denying death is commonplace in our culture. Maybe it's common in every culture. I'm not sure across time. When you go back and look at medieval woodcuts and oil paintings, you do find death coming for people, and those people looking surprised and offended. But my hunch is it's particularly intense during the time we live in, where death is something that by and large we hide away. People die often in hospitals where we don't get to encounter them, unlike a couple generations ago where it was normal to die at home. Thankfully, the hospice movement is bringing back dying at home. The denial of death, pretending that mortality doesn't exist, isn't the biblical way of encountering mortality. Quite the opposite. The Bible names mortality directly and emphatically and in an unvarnished way. The Psalms say over and over again what we heard this morning. There's the language, we're going to go down to the dust. In Ecclesiastes, that beautiful philosophical meets depressive book, we hear the promise that the rich and the poor are going to die, the good and the bad are going to die. Death comes for everyone. And Jesus talks with this startling clarity about not just the inevitability of death, but the inevitability of the cross. He is going to go to the cross, and if we follow him, we too will go to the cross. I want to suggest that talking about death in this direct and honest and accurate way is actually good news. Because if we name that our time is finite, if we name that we are just here for a while, then we are invited to live with urgency. We're invited to love now. We're invited to forgive now. We're invited to find joy now. We're invited to serve now. We're invited to walk humbly with God now. We're invited to let go of little stuff. Liz was saying before the 8 a.m. service that one of the things she's learned working with so much death and dying during her career as a doctor is that when you're confronted with mortality, it's a lot easier not to sweat the small stuff. It just doesn't matter that much. One of the most pathetic things I've ever seen in the church, and that's a judgy word, isn't it? But it's the best one I can come up with. I was at a funeral for a very old woman, and sitting in the front row was another very old woman. And someone told me in a whisper, oh, the woman sitting in the front row is the deceased sister. They have not spoken since 1952. And I thought, I made that same noise that a number of you just made. No, it's okay. That's the appropriate reaction. That is the appropriate reaction to that experience. I thought to myself, like, you won, I guess. Like, you did it, but was it worth it? Like, oh my God. We're just here for a while. What if we live accordingly? So that would be a good moral for us to take from Scripture and from Christian practice. But there is more than that. Scripture doesn't just say that death is something that comes to all of us, that the death rate, no matter how much medical science advances, remains 1 per person. It says more than that. It also says that death is awful. So we don't hear too often from Wisdom of Solomon, but we hear from it this morning. And we hear this promise or declaration that death isn't something that God made, that God takes no delight in death. Death is something that was introduced, Wisdom of Solomon says, by the devil. And if you have experienced an enormous grief, if you are sitting with the presence of absence, the absence of someone you love, you may recognize this and nod in agreement. Indeed, death is diabolical. It is truly awful. And elsewhere in Scripture, we hear the same thing. When Elijah ascends into heaven, his apprentice Elisha rends his garments. That is a biblical response to death. And Jesus stands out of his friend's tomb and weeps. Jesus, who should be as confident in the resurrection as anyone, as confident in heaven as anyone, yet he weeps when he is confronted with death. He's undone by it. Sometimes when someone dies, you'll get one of those cards, or someone will say to you something like, don't be sad, they're in a better place. Or I guess God needed another angel. There's a poem that is sometimes read at funerals, and I'm sort of wandering out on thin ice by talking about this because I'm aware this is a poem that's meaningful to some folks. So let me talk in I language. That's what we're advised to do when we're expressing something difficult. I don't find this poem helpful. The poem is written in the voice of the deceased, and it says something like, don't cry for me, I'm home and I'm fine. And what I experience when I hear that, the story I am making up when I hear that poem, is that someone using the voice of the person I love and wish were still alive is shaming me for being gutted by their death. And I actually don't find that useful. I am undone, and I don't want to be told not to cry in that moment or not to be lost in that moment. Thankfully, That isn't what Scripture calls us to do. That isn't what Scripture invites us to do. Scripture invites us to name grief in its fullness, to do the work of grieving boldly, to grieve fully, and name that death is awful. That God recognizes that Jesus weeps with us outside the tomb. And that too would be a good message for us to take from Scripture and from this practice. We're not alone in our grief. We have a God who is just as appalled by death's permanence, at least this side of heaven, as we are. But there's still more. Scripture also says that death doesn't get the last word, that there is new life coming. There is resurrection coming. I think it's Richard Rohr who says that Jesus always goes towards the pain. Throughout his ministry, you find him choosing to go to people who are suffering and struggling and hurting. And certainly what we hear today in the Gospel of Mark are stories of Jesus choosing to go towards the pain. There's the extraordinary story of this woman who's endured much under many physicians. There's a sentence. And you may have met someone, you may be someone who's endured much under many physicians. And then on either side of it, there's the story of Jairus and his daughter. Jairus is what I want to focus on this morning because we're talking about death and about how Scripture understands it. This story is sort of a echo or rhyme or prefiguration with the story from the Gospel of John of the death of Lazarus. So in both stories, someone calls out to Jesus and says, this person I love is seriously ill, and for whatever reason Jesus doesn't go directly to them. And in the Gospel of John, he just says there's no hurry, which is sort of a weird thing for him to say, but that's what he says in the Gospel of John. Here in the Gospel of Mark, Jairus calls out to him and says, my daughter is so sick, and Jesus is stopped by the woman with the hemorrhage, and she's healed, and they have this whole conversation. And by the time the conversation is at its end, these people come back from Jairus' house, and they utter probably the most callous words to be spoken anywhere in Scripture. Your daughter is dead. Why are you troubling the teacher? And Jesus, this doesn't stop him. He keeps on going towards the pain. He accompanies Jairus to his home, bringing only Peter and John and James with him, the same people who go up the mountaintop to see the transfiguration. And he goes in and he says, it's okay, she's not dead, she's sleeping. People laugh at him. And he goes up and says, get up, get up. And the little girl gets up, she walks around, and she's hungry, so they get her something to eat. As the psalm says, their wailing is turned into dancing. Resurrection. Now we need to be careful here because if the moral of our story is that when someone is very sick, we can call on Jesus and Jesus will make them better, then we have a problem. Because a great many of us have called on Jesus when someone we loved was sick and that person hasn't gotten better. They've died anyway. In my journal, I have a list of people I pray for, and as I get older, the list of people who are dead is becoming the largest of the list, eclipsing the people for whom I'm holding in prayer for other reasons. So many of my mentors are dead. My father is dead. My high school classmate, Hugh, who was a young man, got in a motorcycle and lost an argument with a logging truck. He remains dead. He is like the store at the mall, forever 21. So the moral can't be, or I hope it isn't, if we call on Jesus in the right way, he will bring someone back from the dead. Sometimes miracles do happen. We all have seen miraculous outcomes where either some new treatment is introduced, there's new immunotherapies showing up for cancer all the time, and people have these amazing outcomes that would have been impossible 5 or 10 years ago. And sometimes it's just a mystery why people get better. One of the things I found fascinating, is that a callous word? It is genuinely fascinating to me, hanging out in hospitals, is diseases and cures that doctors call idiopathic. And idiopathic is a long word that means we don't know. We don't know why this is taking place. So sometimes miraculous cures do happen, but many times they don't. Sally Tisdale, the local writer, has talked about her work on a chemo ward and the apparent randomness of who gets better and who doesn't. People who wanted to get better so badly and didn't, and people who weren't, all that committed and did get better. There's this apparent arbitrariness or unfairness. So Jesus going towards the pain and offering healing can't mean always returning to health. This has to be something other than a facile optimism where death can always be undone. And maybe we talked earlier about the cross. This is where the cross, again, is important to us. Jesus says the cross is coming, death is coming, and on the far side of it is the empty tomb. On the far side of it is resurrection, is new life. Not instead of death, but after death, greater than death. That feels like that might be right to me. As the list of people I love and who have died gets longer and longer, I have this sense, I catch this glimpse sometimes that they are with me in a way that they weren't before. Sometimes when I'm in a place like this, in a room full of pews or chairs, I will look out and I will see all of you, but I'll also catch this fleeting glimpse of the others, of all of these people who, in Mr. Rogers' words, loved me into being. I can't quite see them. It's sort of a corner of my eye thing. As Paul says, we're surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses. All of that, I guess, is what I wish Arnold Schwarzenegger had said on Stephen Colbert's show. I wish he had said, death is real, and it is inevitable, and it comes for all of us. When death comes for me, the only one who's going to be terminated is me. I wish he had said, that's awful. That isn't how it should be. That is heart-rending. That leaves this hole in us that is unfair. And God shares with us in that weeping. And I wish he'd said as well that on the far side of that weeping, we have this trust, half seen, but we trust it still, that there is new life coming, that there is resurrection coming, that there's an empty tomb coming. One day, Jesus will come to you and to me, and he will say, get up. And we will get up, and we will eat with him and with all of his friends. On that day, he will turn our wailing into dancing.